Hello and welcome to A Critical Dragon, where I talk about narrative in film, television, and in books. And today I am joined by my good friend, nemesis, Dr. Fantasy himself, Dr. Philip Chase. How are you doing today, Philip?
AP, it's really a delight to be here to have an opportunity to chat with you, my friend. So, I know that you have been going through some migraines and stuff. So I have been deprived of my opportunities to annoy you
Well,
during discussions.
unfortunately, life happens and medical conditions are part of life. And when medical conditions stop you from reading, which is what my particular type of migraine does,
Yeah.
It can make it very difficult to have a YouTube channel that talks about books.
Well, it's just a wee bit of a problem, isn't it?
It does interfere somewhat with your schedule when you have a month and a half where you are physically unable to read.
Yeah, yeah. Well, the good thing is, AP, you've already stuffed your head so full of stories and knowledge about stories that I guess you could probably keep going for a year or two, just making videos based on that stuff that's in there already. So that's a good thing.
You've let the cat out of the bag about any time that I haven't been able to get the things done that I need to be done. That's when a general narrative video goes up. But today I thought one of the things that I find very interesting, particularly about fantasy, but also in science fiction, is in world building, there is a tension between the bias an author has, be it implicit or explicit, and be it conscious or unconscious.
Mhm.
And part of what I mean by this is, and you obviously as a hopefully soon to be best-selling author, because that's what we're hoping for you. But
Oh, thank you.
you've
Yeah.
gone through this process of creating a world. And not to put words into your mouth, but part of that process is you're telling a story and you draw inspiration from the real world and you're creating a secondary world.
Right.
But in that creation, obviously, you take some shortcuts because, you know, you're not an omniscient being as much as your followers on your channel believe you to be.
Oh, I think they know better. I think they all know better.
And because of that, there are things from the cultural milieu in which we are immersed come across because they are a default norm that we never consider.
Yeah.
But then there will also be things that you will have considered because you're actively putting them in the world,
Mm-hmm.
whether to deconstruct them, investigate them, toy with them. And it's all about this awareness of the explicit use of tropes and concepts
Uh-huh.
and the unconscious use of tropes and concepts. So that's kind of the area that I think would be an interesting discussion for today. So now that I've laid that out, and sorry, there's sunlight coming in, so like forgive me for this, but
Oh, no, don't worry. Put on the shades. It's fine. Yeah. They look good.
so Philip, just to give me a moment to recover from this, just why don't you start talking?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Happy to. Well, yeah. So thank you for having me, AP. And it is a really fascinating topic for me because I am someone who did world building with a lot of pilfering from from my experiences in the world around me, and that includes cultures that are long gone, but also experiences and cultures that are still in existence. And so it's interesting because at the time during the creative process, you don't necessarily think through, okay, what kinds of biases am I building into this world as a result of taking things from this culture or from over here. And I think it is something that you may or may not think about explicitly when you're world building. Do you want to build a world where you're mirroring, you're exploring some of the forms of oppression that have existed in our own world? In other words, is there racism in your world? Is there sexism in your world that you're building? And sometimes I think maybe some authors don't think about it. They just put it in there without thought. Whereas other authors think about it and they think, yes, I want to include this because it's something I want to explore. I want people to think about. I want to follow up on. And then there are other authors still who I think take a different approach, which is also very valid, which is to say, hey, this is fantasy. I'm going to imagine a world where there isn't racism or sexism or what have you, or that where there's a diverse group of people, whether it be, skin tone or what have you, living in close proximity to each other. And so these are all things you can do. And if you're doing it that way, you're imagining a world that doesn't have these kinds of oppression or bias or prejudice, then perhaps you're also sending a kind of message. So there are various ways, I think, of going about this. I do think that reflecting on it is important. To me, it is. I know that sometimes people just want to be left alone and think, can I just enjoy the story and not have to think about all this stuff because it's going on in the real world, and I just want to relax while I'm doing this. But for me, anyway, it is something that I find important to think about for whatever reasons. I do think that all of us have biases that we're not aware of. Let's just put that out there. We all have them, and they can creep into our creative work without us realizing. That's why I like to look back and say, oh, wait, I did have a bit of a gender bias when I was writing this scene. This is a little male gazy here, or something like that. And having someone point that out to me is valuable to me. So anyway, those are my general thoughts.
And I think part of it is there is a default norm that we have in society, and every generation, with the passage of time, that default norm changes.
Yes.
And I think one of the clearest examples of this is when we look at Tolkien's work, and you and I both love Tolkien's work. We are unashamed fans of Tolkien.
Hey, why do you think I wear tweed, man?
But when we look at Tolkien's work, when we see how the Southrons and the Easterlings are portrayed, that is very much Orientalism. And that was formed in part by Tolkien's unconscious assimilation of the default norm of his world. Yeah. And that's not to say that Tolkien is a racist, because Tolkien was there's that very famous letter about his correspondence with the German publishers, who were making inquiries as to see whether or not he was Jewish. Right. And he took massive affront to, what the hell does that have to do with anything? I would be proud to be a member of the Jewish community, was essentially what he said. He goes, that has nothing to do with my work. But so he was affronted by that racism. And so we know the kind of character that Tolkien was, and Tolkien wasn't racist, but the cultural milieu in which he was steeped was very, very different to the awareness that we have today, because culture always changes. And so if someone replicates the, all of the good guys are white, all of the bad guys are swarthy or dark, and they do it just because, well, I just was writing this and I was writing about the culture I knew, because authors write about what they know. And I'm writing, a hero like myself or my culture. And then I'm trying to make someone very distinct and different. So that's why they are physically different. You are unconsciously replicating a racist stereotype, even if you as author are not racist. The stereotype is that Orientalist approach to othering according to race and applying that. And that can be, I think that can be a very difficult thing for fans of Tolkien. We, as fans of Tolkien, can get very defensive about attacks on Tolkien for being racist. And that's why I think there's a massive difference between knowingly or unknowingly replicating racist beliefs, or knowingly or unknowingly replicating this culture in which we are steeped.
Right.
And so I think that's an example of part of what we're talking about. But I'll give you a very innocuous example, which hopefully won't upset anyone. So imagine a scene, an author decides that they are going to have a male character and a female character fall in love, and there's a proposal scene. And so the author writes that the male character went down on one knee, lifted up a ring, and proposed to the female character. And you go, well, that seems perfectly normal. You go, because that is our cultural belief about how a proposal should happen. That is very much a sort of unconscious, you would put that in without thought. But why in a fantasy world would it be replicating that tradition from this world? And that is I think, a far less sensitive way or illustration of the thing that we're talking about.
Yeah. I mean, we are products of our cultures and our times, and we are in many ways incapable of seeing outside of that box. And the Tolkien example is perfect. There's also, I think, perhaps even more than the Southrons and the Easterlings, the letter in which he refers to the Orcs and how he created them, much like William Morris's Huns in the Roots of the Mountains, which is one of the 1890s prose romances that William Morris wrote. And Tolkien was very much inspired by William Morris, and these portrayals of the Huns were what we would today call racist portrayals. They were portrayed as ugly and stunted and having long arms that were kind of simian-like, and it's pretty painful to look at that sort of thing,
and heavily influenced. And heavily influenced by that sort of Darwinian thought about more evolved, less evolved, toward the simian or toward the upright, white Caucasoid, civilized European. And for the record, the Irish weren't included in that far end. We were slightly lower down the spectrum.
Oh, I know. Yeah.
Despite the fact it is very hard to find a race paler than us.
That's true. I don't know. It's complicated, I guess, isn't it? But yeah. So he wrote that sort of infamous, I guess, letter in which he described the Orcs as being essentially like William Morris's Huns, and alluded to the fact that it is a sort of a European stereotype of people from a certain part of Asia that he was portraying. And he showed enough awareness in that letter to say, yes, this is a European stereotype, right? So he was obviously cognizant of that. So it's hard to say exactly what level of it was implicit or what level was it explicit, but I agree with you that he was, in his own lifetime, probably a very progressive person. And like you said, there's that other letter where he stands up to the potential German, and there's money at stake here. This obviously, to have his work published in German would have been money in his pocket. But he wrote a very, I think, wonderful reply to that inquiry about whether or not he was Jewish, like you said. And he stood up against apartheid. He did it. He was born in South Africa, although he was, I think, very young when he was taken to England. But nevertheless, he was, for his day, probably a pretty progressive person. So it's interesting to look at how even a genius like Tolkien obviously imbibes things unconsciously, and may repeat narratives that later on we recognize as having their roots in colonialist and racist stereotypes.
And that's what one of the things that we always forget is every new generation is the most progressive generation, because it's progress. It keeps going. And one of the, I think one of the difficulties we have is when our cultural milieu goes, that type of behavior or that type of thought or that type of portrayal is bad. So then when you see it in older works, you judge it according to today. And of course, you should be aware of it from today's perspective. I'm not saying that you shouldn't be aware of it and have that in your mind going, no, this is not how you behave today.
Right.
But that should be coupled with awareness of, and as much as I dislike this phrase, the time in which it was written.
Uh-huh.
When we look at work by Mark Twain,
Mm-hmm.
Mark Twain was replicating language that was in common use and the way that it was used from his time period. That language today is no longer acceptable. No one is saying that it is.
Right.
But it is a window into the culture of the day. Not that that culture should be deemed acceptable, but it was accepted at the time. And we are aware of that. And so that is why I think it is fascinating when we see, particularly within fantasy and science fiction, in which the only limitation that an author truly has is their own imagination. An imposed limitation is what they may want a reader to see, or consideration of audience and whether or not it'll be commercially viable. There are a lot of other considerations that can come in, but the only true limitation is the author's imagination.
Mm-hmm.
And if you want to write a medieval-esque fantasy, you're already deviating from medieval norms because you're moving it into a fantasy world. You're potentially adding in magic, you're adding in dragons, you're adding these other elements. You know, it's not going to be a true representation of medievalism. And even then, medievalism is a fairly broad time period of which not only are there a lot of different cultures and a lot of different technologies and movements and complexities. So it's only ever going to be a nod in the direction of historical realism.
Right.
And changes are going to be made. So why are other things then included? So for instance, a patrilineal monarchy. If an author makes a choice to include a patrilineal monarchy, you go, right, well, that is a choice that you made. As, oh, but this is how it was in the medieval period. You go, no, monarchies weren't always patrilineal. And in fact, even in certain cultures, we have matrilineal lineages because you can always 100% prove who the mother was. Mm-hmm. You can't necessarily 100% prove who the father was. And so in a fantasy world, that can actually be a really interesting plot hook as to why one kingdom, and even then using the word kingdom, instead of using the word like a monarchy or
right.
But it's even gendered language coming in can unconsciously sway your construction of this.
We don't even think about it. Yeah, to go back to a couple of things, it's interesting how a text also can change with time and is judged differently by people at different points in time. Take an example, like it's not exactly fantasy, more, I guess, proto-historical fiction, but Walter Scott's Ivanhoe, there's a text where for its day, the early 19th century, you could argue that the portrayal of the Jewish characters is actually kind of sympathetic, right? They are preyed upon by some very evil Christian characters. On the other hand, clearly, there are some awful stereotypes that are being recycled in Ivanhoe as well at the same time. Or you could take something like Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, right? There's a good example of a text that in its day in the early 20th century, okay, it's very critical of colonialism at a time when you didn't see a lot of European and American authors being openly critical of colonialism. So yeah, progressive, but it also contains within it, we're looking back on it today and reading it, and it's like, oh, this is that there's some awful stereotypes in there as well, and some narratives like, that we recognize today as being part of that very colonialist agenda that maybe was just unconsciously passed along. So yeah, I mean, it just happens all the time, and it happens in fantasy, obviously.
Well, I mean, there's an interesting one with the inspiration, say, for the hobbits in the Lord of the Rings, where Merry, Pippin, and Frodo are very much inspired by, I'm not going to say analogous to, but inspired by that, going off to World War One, the well-educated public school boys who, you know, volunteered, and then Sam is very much the working class Batman who goes with them.
Yeah,
And we then talk about the camaraderie that they develop, the PTSD that happens to Frodo very significantly during the text, and to a certain extent, but lesser extent, Sam.
Mm-hmm.
But we talk about that in terms of the band of brothers. And, you know, this is very much about that brotherhood that develops between them, this bond between soldiers. And you sort of go, yeah, but in the modern day, we have women serving in the armed forces.
Yeah.
Is it still the band of brothers? Are we still talking about fraternity and not including some aspect of sorority? And it's an unconscious element that is in the text, because in Tolkien's world and experience, that was the men who went off to war, who went to the front. It was men on the front. But nowadays, if we had that same construction, we could have female hobbits doing it. And yet, because of the cultural time lag, the idea of female hobbits being corresponding to this band of brothers idea, it becomes uncomfortable or not as easy to imagine.
Mm-hmm.
We have the construct of Gandalf, and you go, Gandalf is not a man. Gandalf is, spoiler alert, basically an angelic being who has manifested as a wise old man. You go,
one of the Istari,
So why is he a he? Why does he have a long beard? Because that was recognizably a symbol or construction of wisdom. That's what we expected. But there's nothing inherently male about wisdom.
Right.
And so Gandalf as a being,
the beard helps me a little bit, I think.
But you know, Gandalf as a woman, why is it so difficult for our culture to imagine Gandalf as a woman? The character is meant to be wise and a guiding mentor, but we have female mentors, we have female wisdom, we have female educators, we have female geniuses. That this is not something that is inherently male. And yet suggesting to people that, you know, Gandalf could be a woman is so antithetical to how we approach it. It goes against that cultural milieu, that bias, that inherent bias, an unconscious bias that permeates Tolkien's text, but also still permeates to a significant degree our own world, that we find it very difficult to step outside that.
Yeah, there's also I would argue, a fairly unreflective replication of class structure in Lord of the Rings, in the relationship between Samwise and Frodo. And this is something that if you are only a film watcher and you haven't read the books, I mean, he still calls him Master Frodo, right? In the films,
Mr. Frodo, sir.
Yeah, does he call him Master in the films? I'm trying to remember if he does or not. But in the book, he's Master. I mean, this is a word that is very much, I think, has connotations to it that you could analyze for sure.
Well, and I think that actually is going to be very different from a UK standpoint and from an American standpoint, just because of the different constructions and understanding of class.
Yeah, but even in the modern UK, I think people have moved on from that, haven't they? That master-servant relationship that is so, look, don't get me wrong, it's very endearing in some ways, because the loyalty of Sam to Frodo is very much part of this very old narrative. It goes way back. You can see it celebrated much earlier in the 19th century as people wanted to relive the Middle Ages. You know, they had been, I think there were a lot of thinkers like Thomas Carlyle or John Ruskin and later William Morris who saw industrialism and capitalism as this disruption of a social system that worked for centuries, where you had a symbiotic relationship between the the one percenters and the rest of us schmucks down there, rolling in the mud. But the idea is that the people on the top of the social hierarchy were taking care of us, right? They were paternal.
Yeah, a Patreon system.
Yeah, and then the rest of us, we had our duties that were all laid out, and everybody lived. This is a very idealized version of the Middle Ages, that this narrative, but everybody was happy because they had their place. They forgot to mention, like plagues and stuff like that. But that's the narrative, though, that goes all the way to. I think you can trace it all the way to that. And like I said, it's very endearing in some ways, that relationship between Samwise and Frodo. But it is clearly a servant-master relationship in the books. Probably it's a little bit muddied in the films, I would say.
I think it has been toned down quite significantly in the films. Yeah. But even when we talk about patronage, about having a patron who sponsors the arts, that classical system of, here's this person and they're going to give money to the arts and they're going to look after you. So you have the high status individual being the patron, and it's talked about as patronage. And yet when we talk about someone being patronizing,
yeah,
and we can see how even the linguistics have changed, that patronizing now has a very different tone. And yet, obviously, like one of the things online is, you can set up a Patreon to have patrons who support you.
Who patronize you.
Who patronize you. Yes, you're a very good YouTuber. Well done. Have a coffee.
Right.
You try so hard, AP. Learn how to do video editing. But even something like that the etymology of where these words come from, where the concepts come from, and how they change over time are, again, part and parcel of this shifting of culture, of cultural understanding, of the unconscious default setting,
right,
where we are. And it can be seen in so many things, that if you want to talk, even if we talk a little tiny bit about a scene from your world. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to pause just for a second. I'm going to pause the recording because I want to clear this example with you before we talk about it.
Oh, sounds good. Yeah.
Okay. So
we figured that out.
And aren't you glad I checked? Because that would have given away the entire ending of the entire series. So the what I wanted to talk about, the thing I wanted to talk about.
Ooh, AP, that was clever. Yeah.
Is you included from, well, why don't you explain this?
Oh, sure. Yeah. So there are a couple very, I guess these words are rich with connotation if you're familiar with Old English and Old Norse. But in Old English, like a meeting of peers was called a moot. And that's one word, but in the sagas, in the Icelandic material, there's this thing called a thing, which is a meeting. It's like a moot. It's like a council, or something like that. And there is a place in Iceland even where they get together. I think it's called the Thingvang, right? Is this plain, this field of where they have the thing, which means something else. It means a meeting, right? But of course, I wanted to call it that because of the rich Nordic connotations, but you pointed out, and I'll let you take over.
Well, I pointed out, as you did, that there are other words that you can use, like moot, which, one of the modern connotations for using a moot is obviously a legal moot, where it's a test trial for young lawyers to test things out. But we understand a moot as a meeting, whereas calling it, "Oh, are you going to go to the thing tonight?" in the modern context and right, in modern language and how your modern reader is going to approach it, it's oh, so they're going to this thing. Well, does he not have a better word? No, the thing is actually the word. That it can snag a reader's eye, and that's because our understanding of language has changed. That the right, connotation of calling something a thing, even though it is historically accurate to the culture that you were drawing from,
right,
For a modern reader who is unaware of that, they are not going to understand that connotation. If they don't understand that connotation, what connotation are they going to get for it? And they go, oh, well, he couldn't think of a better word, so he just called it a thing.
But
It's
not
a
very
placeholder.
creative. Yeah, yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's interesting how I also think that we earlier, to go back to something we were talking about, how often we find in writing the unconscious replication of social systems and beliefs and biases. You definitely have your writers who deliberately try to do something different at various points, and like Ursula Le Guin in the late 60s, choosing in A Wizard of Earthsea to make her the people brown, right? And her protagonist is brown, although you often see Ged portrayed as white on the book covers.
And this is fine because she went out of her way very specifically to make him not white, and yet book covers, illustrations, fan drawings, and animations and adaptations have almost universally made Ged white.
Yeah, which was very upsetting to her. I know, and as late as that awful sci-fi Wizard of Earthsea series. So yeah, there's that, and of course the Malazan books we've talked about so many times about how Erikson and Esselmont made deliberate choices in the power structure and the terms of the default isn't white, it's brown in the Malazan world, right?
And that, I think, it's very interesting when authors try to change the default setting of the world, and yet we as readers often, when we read it, still revert to our default because as we've discussed before about reader response theory, the text is the text, but a reader is an active co-participant in the creation of the world. And if the reader has a different default to that of the text, it can lead to reading against the text and making it a very dissatisfying read because the text is not performing the way that you expect it to. But it can also lead to misreading the text, misimagining the text, because as your default is one thing and the text default is another, if you haven't noticed that, and that's why even with some of the Malazan works, that a lot of the fan artwork, as stunning as it is, or even fan castings for a fictional film adaptation, quite often cast white actors instead of how they are portrayed within the series, because that is a default mode. And I think fantasy sometimes actually even has a problem, not just white as a default, but male as a default. That if a character is unnamed and is speaking, and we haven't had any physical description, that there's almost an assumption that that character is going to be male until proven otherwise. And it's not about wokeness or anything like that. It's understanding that a default has been established over many generations. And while a lot of modern fantasy is trying to do different things, that default isn't set in stone. It doesn't have to be set in stone. And fantasy worlds have this opportunity to explore different things. And as we move through time, as we become more and more progressive and learned and more understanding of different cultural viewpoints and the ramifications of why certain default positions can actually be harmful, even if we individually don't find them to be so, that can lead to a very interesting change in the genre. But we are still left with all of the works that came before that unknowingly or unconsciously had incorporated default norms that are now not necessarily the norm that we conform to.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It's a little bit like, I don't know if this ever happened to you. Probably. I don't think I'm that crazy. But driving to work, you have a routine. You go the same road every day and you're not thinking. And sometimes you can even just sort of realize, oh, I'm almost there. I didn't even think about this drive because you've done it so many times. You're in your sort of, you can cruise along in your brain and you're not having to think about it.
The people who insure Philip's car, just ignore what he just said. He's not zoning out. He's driving very, very carefully.
I mean, the part of my brain that's paying attention is driving very well. So I promise you, I'm not causing traffic accidents on the way to work every day.
Well, you wouldn't know. You'd zoned out.
Yeah.
There's just chaos behind you on the road. All these cars and
destruction behind me on the road. Maybe that wasn't the best metaphor, but anyway, we're gonna roll with it. So you have this way of just going about your business without thinking about what you're doing. And I think that most of the time that's how we are with our cultural assumptions. And it's hard, it's work to actually step out of that and evaluate it. So like I said at the beginning, it's something that I value because I think it helps me to be a better reader and to understand what I'm doing and to understand my own biases sometimes, which are there. I mean, let's face it, we all have our biases.
Yeah, so. And that's why I think it's important that this is not to say, and again, to go back to the point that we had at the beginning, it's not that Tolkien was being racist.
No, yeah.
There was a cultural default, and without thinking about it, because he was so immersed in it, it was what he knew, it was what he understood. So that's what he was replicating on the page.
Yeah.
But if you tried to do that now, if you wrote that style now, we have a different cultural default. So you can see why, even if you replicated almost exactly what Tolkien did, why in the modern day it could be viewed differently because we have a different cultural milieu. And I think this is something that, you know, I think it causes people anxiety because they feel that they're being called out for being racist or being sexist, when a lot of it has to do with our own culture. And every single one of us is learning every day. Like, it is a continual process. We cannot be experts on every single facet of social constructions across every single culture in the Western, Eastern, and on the entire planet. Like, we just can't. It's not possible for any one person to do that. But we have to be open to learning. And it can be exceptionally challenging and hurtful and surprising when someone says, what you just said is completely and utterly unacceptable. And you can be shocked by it. You can be taken aback by it because you didn't mean any offense. It's a common phrase where you're from. And someone explains to you, well, what that means is this, and the ramification of that is this. And that's not attacking you or saying that your culture is wrong. It's time has moved on, time has changed. And some cultures focus on different elements to move on first. And different segments of different cultures and different communities focus on different elements. And it's all a complete learning experience. It's every day is a chance to learn. Every day is a school day. And instead of, one of the ones that amuses me, people talk about cancel culture. And you know, back in the day, it used to be, what was it, in the 19th century, it was called boycotting. Canceling someone, boycotting someone is not a new thing. Oh, that's so woke. I saw a comment about the newly announced Marvel show about She-Hulk, going, oh, Marvel's gone woke. You know, She-Hulk, the character that was in the Avengers and was first published in 1980. So if Marvel has gone woke this year, then traveled back in time 42 years to create She-Hulk, that's wokeness. Or the allegations about Neil Gaiman, or not allegations about Neil, accusations thrown at Neil Gaiman by fans of the Sandman, complaining about, it was Gwendolyn Christie was cast as Lucifer.
I saw that.
And Gaiman, I think, is just so fed up. We had Gwendolyn Christie was cast as Lucifer, but in Constantine the film, it was Tilda Swinton was cast as the Archangel Gabriel. And that wasn't labeled as woke back then, but now suddenly it is woke. And you're like, but also angels aren't humans in the same way. They are meant to look different, be different. That, what does it matter? The character is beyond their physicality. And so much of this is about this trying to consolidate what the cultural norm is. Because if you can consolidate the cultural norm as your norm, then you're right and everyone else is wrong.
Yeah.
Instead of seeing it as cultural norms change, and we can either change with them or we become old-fashioned, and we are all destined to become old-fashioned, all of us. You probably more than me, Philip, because at least I know how to work technology most of the time.
Hey. Tweed will never go out of fashion. Okay, you heard it here, folks.
But and this is it. We are surrounded by culture, and it's different for every person, even within, say, the UK or Australia or America, depending on where you are in those places, depending on what your spiritual or religious beliefs are, what your educational system was, what your family is like, what your socioeconomic background is. All of these things feed into your personal cultural understanding. And we always then refer to our own personal one as the default because it's our natural position. And when we are challenged with other people's default, that is where tension arises, and we can either communicate and learn,
right,
or become adversarial. And that's I think part of the tension that we see in a lot of these discussions, and it's why it hurts us when we hear Tolkien being accused of being racist, when what we're talking about is the aspects in his work that he incorporated. And it wasn't necessarily that he was going around being incredibly rude to people of different races.
Right. Yeah, I think awareness of all these things is incredibly important. And it feels sometimes like there's this narrative that we've come to a point where we can't even have these discussions anymore, that people just aren't willing to listen. And I don't know how true that is. I feel like sometimes, yes, that we're in an interesting cultural moment when there seem to be some pretty big divides, and that people either just want to shut down these kinds of conversations entirely, or get angry, or what have you. I don't know how new that is necessarily. It's hard to say. I feel like a lot of us feel like we're at a point in time when these kinds of conversations are less and less possible to have, and in a rational and respectful way where people are learning. I don't know if that's the case. I think that could be exaggerated too.
But I think social media exacerbates the volume of this. But this has been a problem since tribal society A living in a cave met tribal society B living in a different cave. And one of them rubbed the sticks left to right to start the fire, and the other rubbed the sticks right to left to start the fire. And it was that you're doing it the wrong way. The human condition is, I mean,
read Gulliver's Travels. Read Gulliver's Travels, right? Where no, it's the small end of the egg you have to break. No, it's the big end of the egg, and they have a huge war over it, right? So,
and humanity has been plagued by this, and will always be plagued by this until we learn to listen more than we talk, which is very difficult for me.
Well, we're all in the process of learning, AP.
Every day is a school day. I am a work in progress. I don't think I will ever be finished.
But today, AP, with those shades on, for you, my friend, it's a cool day.
Oh my God. But I think we've covered a lot of this, and this is like a very big, expansive, complicated, nuanced topic, and there are a lot of different conversations that you can have in it. And you and I, this is the start of a conversation. This is not the definitive, this is what the thing is. That, we only have two different viewpoints. This is a conversation that has to happen with a lot of different people in a lot of different contexts. And, we will unconsciously replicate behaviors or turns of phrase that may be hurtful to other people. And it's never our intent.
I've done it before. I have absolutely been in situations where I realized that the way I said something was probably insensitive to certain people who I was saying it to, and realized, I look back and wince at some of the things I said, even in a classroom, and think, oh, I should have done that better. But that was the me from 20 years ago who didn't know better. And
also, we're all fallible. It's not that any one of us is infallible
right.
and we can make mistakes. It's refusing to admit that a mistake has ever been made, or refusing to learn from a mistake. And you can try, and you can try and fail, but there is, I think, worth in at least trying.
Absolutely. That's what we can do. Yeah.
Thank you very much for joining me for this discussion, Philip. I think maybe we could follow it up with another discussion, maybe with another broad topic like this to get into it, because hopefully once your book gets published, we can start using examples from your book, which would be awesome.
That would be fun. Yeah, that would be very fun, because there are particular scenes that I think improved as a result of getting feedback from you, and that I'm very proud of the fact that I was willing to listen to someone like you who was saying, hey, you know, this scene could come across, you know, this way, and maybe you should do it a little bit like this. And so I'm glad that I was able to listen to things like that, because I do feel like this actually is a better story now. But
well, in my defense, I wasn't telling you you must change something. I was going,
absolutely never did that. No.
Like you have this scene. This is what's being depicted in the scene. Some readers may interpret this as X, Y, and Z.
Right.
Here's what you want the scene to do, because looking at the function of a scene is very different to what the scene actually is. It's like the difference between Campbell's The Hero with a Thousand Faces and looking at the hero's journey, and then applying that to an actual folktale.
Which never works entirely.
It never works entirely, but understanding the function, what the scene is sort of doing, and not just what it's telling. And there are different ways to achieve that function. And you go, well, if you change this one aspect, you can still start at the same place, end at the same place, still do the thing that the scene is meant to do, but without falling into a potential trap. Now, that may mean that you avoid one landmine and step on another. Because you cannot write to committee, you can't write for every single individual circumstance. You have to write the best story that you know how. And I think that is something that really comes across in your work, regardless of any of the points that I made, was that you had written a compelling, interesting, engaging story. And all I ever did was sort of poke at little bits of it and go, this bit's a bit wobbly, or see this bit, maybe like there's this thing about this bit, have a wee think about it. And
I think that the willingness to listen to that is it's the key to a lot of conversations. The willingness to listen and get better, right?
And I am very grateful that I have someone like you who is willing to listen to me.
Well, I'm happy to listen, my friend. So,
okay. Well, thank you very much, Philip. For those of you still watching, thank you very much for watching. Thank you for your continued support, and we will see you in the next one.